The evolution of CPUs since the 1980s has been nothing short of amazing. The beginning CPUs, the 8086s and 8088s, were nowhere near as powerful as the CPUs that we use today. But there were a lot that were in between as well. The 8386s, for example, divided themselves into two sections. The 8386SX, which only had a 16-bit path, and the 8386DX, which had a 32-bit path. The 32-bit path has become common today. That's like a 32-lane highway versus a 16-lane highway. But the difference is tremendous. A 16-bit path processor can address 16 megabytes of memory, or 16 million bytes of memory. But a 32-bit path can address 4 billion, 4,000 million, in other words, bytes of memory. That's a huge difference just by doubling the path size. The first Pentiums ran at 60 megahertz speed. As we said, the average of processors today is about 550 megahertz. But there are some processors today that run well over 1 gigahertz. So there have been a lot of changes in processors over the years. Another thing that's changed is the voltages that the processors use. Earlier CPUs used 5 volts. Later versions used 3.3 volts. The first Pentiums used 5 volts. All the other Pentiums after the first Pentiums now use 3.3, 2.8. Matter of fact, there are some processors now that are even lower than 2.8, down to about 1.5 volts. Older processors used coprocessors, like a math coprocessor, for example, which performed mathematical calculations. But newer processors actually have built-in arithmetic logic units. They can perform many calculations at the same time. They're true multiprocessors now. So when we compare processors, we're comparing bus speed, processor speed, multipliers, and memory caches. Bus speed is the speed at which data moves on the bus itself. Processor speed is what we commonly refer to as the speed of the processor. In other words, the processor speed is the 550 megahertz or the 1.2 gigahertz that we see when we look at an ad for a computer. A multiplier is a factor by which the bus speed or the frequency is multiplied to get the CPU clock speed. It's all part of the coordination of the computer. And the memory cache is a small amount of faster RAM that stores recently retrieved data. The purpose of a cache is that really computers aren't smarter than people. People are smarter than computers because people program computers. But what computers do very well is they have the ability to do the same thing over and over and over again very fast. So the purpose of a cache is so that once a computer does something, the resources that are required to do it again are kept very close so that it can do it the second time even faster. So now that we know a little bit about processors, next we'll take a look at how cache helps processors. As we discussed earlier, cache is a way of storing information so that when a computer needs to use it again, it's closer and more available and therefore speeds up processing. It works off of the principle that a computer keeps doing the same thing over and over and over again. But there are many different types of cache. There's what's called internal cache or L1 cache, and this cache is located actually inside of the processor itself. And then there's what's called external cache or L2 cache, and this cache is stored either inside the module with a processor or actually outside on the system board itself. Depending on where the cache is stored, we have two different types of buses. A front side bus is a bus that connects L2 cache that's stored outside of the CPU housing to the CPU itself. A backside bus, or what's also called a cache bus, is a very short bus that connects the L2 cache stored inside of the CPU housing to the CPU itself. So cache makes a huge difference in processing speed, and L2 cache is particularly important and was part of the change in the evolution of the CPU. As a matter of fact, the classic Pentiums had L1 caches, small L1 caches of 16 kilobytes, but no L2 cache at all. Even the first Pentium MMX only had a 32K L1 cache and no L2 cache. But since then, we've added additional L2 cache as we have improved the speed of a processor. L2 cache is a tremendously important component. Now let's take a look at some of Intel's most popular chips and the evolution of Intel CPUs. The purpose of discussing the most common Intel processors at this point is to do two things. Number one, to give you some familiarity with them so that you'd recognize them out in the field. And number two is to use some of the terminology that we've just learned and to see how it's applied. So the first Pentiums, called the classic Pentium, were introduced in 1993. They're no longer manufactured, but a lot of them were sold, and speeds ranged from 60 megahertz to 200 megahertz. The next step was for gamers. MMX, multimedia extension or multimedia experience, depending on who you ask, targeted the home market. It sped up graphical applications. Games that are designed to work with MMX perform very well on a chip that's designed for MMX. For more serious computer users, Pentium Pro was released. Pentium Pro is recommended for 32 applications, rely heavily on fast access to large amounts of cache memory. It was the first Pentium to offer the all-important level 2 cache inside of a CPU housing. And it was popular for computing-intensive workstations and servers. But it doesn't perform well with the older 16-bit applications that were written for DOS or for Windows 3X. So Pentium processors were very popular, and additional Pentium processors came out, like the Pentium II. The Pentium II works very well with 3D graphic manipulation and things like computer-aided drafting and multimedia presentations. The Pentium II was also the first processor to use a slot to install the processor. In other words, the processor was installed into a component along with its L2 cache, and that slot, called slot 1, or that component, was plugged into a slot called slot 1 on the board. Pentium II chips went up to 450 megahertz. The next line of processors that Intel introduced were the Celeron processors. These were a low-end Pentium II processor. The very first Celeron processors didn't have any L2 cache at all. They didn't perform very well either, so the Intel released additional Celeron processors that did have L2 cache within the processor housing, and those work very well with Windows 95. A high-end processor called a Xeon processor is another one you might see. Xeon processors can even be in groups of 8 on one computer, and they're recommended for very high-end powerful servers and workstations. Also recommended for the newer operating systems, the more sophisticated operating systems like Windows NT and Windows 2000 and Unix operating systems. The next generation of processor, Pentium III, runs with 100 megahertz, 133 megahertz memory buses, and could get speeds up to 1 gigahertz. Intel introduced a new enhancement called SSE, which is a new instruction set designed to improve multimedia processing even further. The newest processor, not even released yet, but the very latest next generation processor will be called Itanium. This will be Intel's first 64-bit processor for microcomputers. It'll provide backward compatibility with older 32-bit applications. So processors have come a long way. Next we'll take a look at some of the challenges that we face when increasing processing speed and how that's being handled.